Hey everybody, and today I want to talk to you about how mental health is not just a spectrum, but a double spectrum. We're not going to do any shout outs or adverts, anything like that at the beginning right now. If you want any of that, it's in the description. I put all the places to catch me there, but I want to jump straight in and talk about this. You may have never heard the expression double spectrum before, and in fact, I'm going to say you haven't, because I made it up in the shower this morning. It's come off the back of me thinking about mental health essentially all the time. It's an obsession, okay? I never really take a break from it. That's kind of a problem, but that's not what we're talking about here, right? What we're talking about is the fact that mental health itself is a spectrum. There is an entire spectrum of mental health, mental illness, mental conditions, and we're beginning to get our heads around this idea now. We're beginning to actually see that not all mental health is the same. But this idea of a double spectrum, the idea behind it is to say that within each of these mental health conditions, not all mental health is actually the same. So for example, you can take it that someone with depression and someone with anxiety are going to react very, very differently. However, have you thought of the idea that someone with anxiety and someone else with anxiety may also react very, very differently? Someone with depression and another person with depression may also react very, very differently. Now, this shouldn't come as too much of a surprise, because a person without depression doesn't automatically act like every other person without depression. We have intricate personalities and we have differences between person to person, and we don't even expect a person to. But as soon as a person has a mental health label on them, when our understanding level of mental health is here and we've got a little bit of an understanding around mental health, we're doing a bit of education around it, but we've not really spent too much time with that, it can be very easy for our brain to actually create this idea that every single person that has this condition would present in the exact same way. And it's just not true. Now, why is this important? Well, ultimately, having these assumptions, they're called heuristics. They're actually there to help our brain take shortcuts so it doesn't have to do too much work in every scenario. And they're really helpful for us in a lot of situations. But if we have these heuristics in place when we're actually trying to learn about people and the different mental illnesses and mental conditions that are out there, they can actually stall our education and our understanding at one level. Added into this, a lot of people get that initial heuristic from TV, from entertainment, and as a result it can be very, very far off the mark. We've got to understand that TV and entertainment sometimes need to exaggerate certain parts around mental illness in order to make them interesting. I have type 2 bipolar disorder, which is probably really interested in a filmmaker's wet dream when I am symptomatic, but then there's times when genuinely life with bipolar disorder can be quite boring. And I think this is just something that I always accepted and always knew, because I've met other people with bipolar disorder throughout my entire life, and we are massively different. We experience things in different ways, and parts of their condition aren't relatable to me, parts of my condition isn't relatable to them, but then there's a lot of overlap in the middle. But there's not one underpinning kind of thing that you can even sit to and say, every single person reacts like that, because it just doesn't happen. Even within my work with mental health, where I'm actually speaking and dealing with people with various mental illnesses on a daily basis, it is very hard to overcome that urge to actually see patterns and actually fit people into boxes. But when we actually do that, we then stop listening to the intricacies and the nuances of that particular person's situation, and as a result, those things could end up being the thing that person needs the most help with. And a really important thing on top of all of this is the person wants to be treated like a person. Person first, condition in the background, not the person being treated as a condition with their personality being in the background. So when we jump in and immediately assume that we understand their situation, then it can actually be very off-putting, because a person thinks that you've actually now, rather than wanting to learn about them from them, you want to learn about them from someone else that you know who had the same situation. Can you imagine that outside of mental illness? It's like someone that you met comes from a particular town, so you treat him as if that everybody from that town is the same, and then the next time you meet someone from that town, you're like, oh yeah, my friend John comes from Birmingham and he's like this, so you must be like this too. It's kind of ridiculous. So if you want to move past this, a really easy question you can ask, which will actually help the person that you're talking to feel seen and acknowledged, is if they open up to you about having a particular mental illness condition, you say, oh wow, what's that like for you? That addition of the word for you at the end shows that you don't just want to know what the condition is, you want to know what that person's experience with that condition is, and then that'll help you connect with that person on a deeper level. The person that you're speaking to is going to benefit from this, but then you're also going to benefit from it as well, because instead of your brain then having one or two different variations of something like bipolar or like autism and thinking that this is all of these situations are exactly the same way, when we start building up that kind of rich tapestry of how people can be within these conditions, we then start breaking down the stigma within ourselves, which in turn helps relieve the stigma for the people with those conditions. It's a win-win situation all around. And as a final note, because most of what I've said so far would be aimed towards people outside of these conditions to help them understand people who have these conditions better, if you are someone who has a specific condition, your interpretation of that condition, your representation of that condition doesn't need to be exactly the same as somebody else's. If there is something different about that condition for you, that is perfectly normal. And again, you will then begin to see that within each individual spectrum, there is its own individual spectrum. And this is what this idea of a double spectrum is. The idea that we have this vast spectrum of mental health and conditions, but within each condition we have this individual spectrum that is there of the representation, of the interpretation of the people that struggle with that particular condition. So as always, I hope this has helped, and if it has, please drop a subscription on here, because remember, it's priceless to you, but also it is priceless to me. There are more links for where to find me in the description below. I'm not going to bombard you with an advert. Go and check those out, and I will see you soon.